My name is Frank Walker. I'm an historian associated with the Orange County, Virginia Historical Society and the James Madison Museum of Orange County Heritage. Today's talk is on gold mining in the Virginia wilderness, tales of greed, hard work, and adventure in a forbidding land. We begin with gold appearing in Virginia, and don't feel bad that you missed it, since it happened some 460 million years ago. You wouldn't look too well today. What happened was a line of cracks opened up in the tectonic plate that was becoming the eastern border of North America, and out of those cracks welled a tremendous amount of volcanic material that flowed out over the land, cooled and hardened. This was during, I think, what they call the Ordovician period. And then over the hundreds of millions of years that followed, degradation of that volcanic material and erosion removed most of it, except for pockets here and there in Virginia, and of course the material right in the mouth of the crack itself. And this line of cracks, to position it geographically today, runs from Maryland to Alabama, and Virginia, as you see from this illustration, has one of those cracks totally within its boundaries, running roughly from Fauquier to Buckingham County. Now the legacy of this volcanic extrusion is twofold. One, wherever any soil material remains from the degraded volcanic material, you have got poor soil. I mean, you've heard of dirt poor. This is a level below dirt poor. It's naturally infertile, naturally acidic, usually shallow and poorly drained, just a terrible soil to challenge any farmer to raise a crop on. And if you know that's what you're raising a crop on, and you have to do what you need to do to amend that soil, your costs of production are extraordinarily high. The other legacy, and I should say that where this material is at various places in the state, the land has earned some specific terms, such as the poison fields or the desert. In fact, there's a section of Madison County called the desert. And John Elder, when he was mapping soils in Madison County, said he could map the desert soils on the basis of abandoned farmland. The other legacy, however, of this volcanic extrusion is and are, or whatever, a extensive deposition of metals, all kinds of metals, iron, lots of iron, a tremendous amount of iron, copper, silver, zinc, lead, and gold. Yes, indeed, gold. The geologists call this the volcanic plutonic belt along the east coast. Rockhounds and miners called it the Gold-Pyrite belt, because those are the most famous items that seem to come out of this material. Pyrite, of course, is a iron sulfide product that's known as fool's gold, and it can fool you because sometimes there actually is a little gold mixed in with it, and you mine everything that's there. Now, the iron was the first stuff that was mined. We take a look at the surface geology, and looking to the left, you can see the black boundary, I hope, of Orange County, and over on the left is the greenstone and some of that other good rock that's weathered to produce Davidson clay loam, which is the richest soil east of the Mississippi, and some of its cousins, Congaree, Chihuahua, other soils like that. Fabulously rich, fertile soils, and that's where we have our huge plantations and our grand plantation houses. You move further east, and there is the Everona limestone belt, that white streak, and you get on the other side of the Everona, and the soils start getting poorer and poorer and poorer. But you are headed towards iron. And by the time you get to the eastern end of Orange County, and I should have pointed out, that's Orange County you see outlined in red there. All the eastern end of it is over that crack. When you finally get to the eastern end of Orange County, you're right over that volcanic crack, and you have iron ore that's just sitting on top of the ground. And it was discovered fairly early, and blast furnaces, ultimately something like 6 blast furnaces were operating on these ore beds that are in eastern Orange, western Spotsylvania, southern Culpeper, and northern Louisa counties. The needs of those furnaces to smelt this iron ore required that woodland, great huge swaths of woodland, were cut, clear cut, to feed the furnaces. And while the timber cutters probably could not tell that they were on terribly poor soil at the time they were cutting, when they came back to look at the regrowth that was starting, it was clear that this was very, very poor land. What came back was a struggling regrowth of absolutely everything that can grow in this part of Virginia: vines, briars, shrubs, scrubs, canebrakes, you name it, all fighting for light, fighting for water, fighting for the few nutrients that are there, and none of it doing real well. It was a temperate zone jungle, some 70 square miles in its largest dimension, and it earned the name wilderness. Spell it with a capital W because it was man-made. And gold lurked in this wilderness for about another century until it was discovered. The iron was obvious, the gold was not. The first real pronouncement, public pronouncement, that we get of the presence of gold in Virginia comes to us from that fearless promoter of all things Virginia, that intrepid master of the superlative hype, Thomas Jefferson. In 1782, Jefferson announced publicly that a 4-pound lump of gold ore had been found beside the Rappahannock River downstream of Fredericksburg, and that lump of gold ore had been tried, that is, had been smelted, and had produced 7 pennyweight of gold. Jefferson was so proud of that announcement that he repeated it again in his 1787 Notes on Virginia. The response in both cases was a huge yawn. Farming was still making a little bit of money. Everybody knew how to farm. Gold was strange. How did you do gold? Nobody knew. Nobody really knew, and nobody really wanted to know. Farming was still good. Also, if that lump of gold ever existed, the mother lode for it was never found. Anybody who looked around couldn't find a lump of gold ore like that. In fact, I'm not sure a lump of gold ore like that existed, because 7 pennyweight of gold from a 4-pound lump of ore, that's over 100 ounces of gold per ton of ore worked. And not much was known about gold. Some gold was being mined, but not in Virginia. It was well known that there was no such thing as gold yielding to that degree. So things remained calm for a little while longer. But by the 1820s, there was a different tune being played in the Virginia landscape. By then, many of Virginia's soils had been farmed for 200 years or longer. They were simply getting worn out, even Davidson. And a lot of them were washing down the rivers into the Chesapeake Bay from poor soil management. Also, huge droughts, the string of droughts had struck Virginia farmland. And lastly, the War of 1812 was over, and European farmers were back in the commodity markets, driving prices down. It was time to find another income if it was possible. In fact, between 1820 and 1860, roughly 1 million people living in Virginia, including what we call today West Virginia, emigrated out of here to go find somewhere else a better opportunity, a better chance to try to make a living. Now, the White brothers, William and Edmund White, had recently inherited Whitehall Plantation in Spotsylvania County, and they decided that it was time to look into this gold business. They knew there was a little gold. Some people had told them, or they had seen, in stream eddies or what have you. Nothing that really had attracted them much, but now it was time to really see if there was something there. And the White brothers went down to North Carolina. North Carolina at that time was the leading producer of gold in the United States. They had been commercially mining there since about 1800. And they talked to mine managers, mine operators, miners, people who were in the business of buying and selling gold, and learning what it was going to take to get a mining operation going. And they came back to Spotsylvania County determined to establish the Whitehall mine. And in fact they did. And the Whitehall was a well-known, highly respected operation that continued up into the 20th century. The thing is, though, the White brothers found out that while they were gone, they had been upstaged. That William Jones, at his Ellwood plantation, which is just across Wilderness Run from Whitehall, William Jones had hit big gold along Wilderness Run. It was the talk of the region. And William Jones and his son-in-law, Judge John Coulter, were leasing mining tracts to individual miners to work those tracts. And as it turned out, this was 1826, and over the next few years, one or two of those miners returned between $3,000 and $4,000 a year to Jones and Coulter. And that was in an era when a man could work hard every good day all year long and not make $300. This was real huge wealth. So you got the White brothers with their gold, and you got William Jones with his. And about the same time, just a little further downstream, down Wilderness Run from William Jones, Dr. Peyton Grimes starts the Vaucluse mining operation. So in 1826, this is the landscape of the Wilderness gold fields. The red star in the middle, down below in the middle, that's the location of the Whitehall mine. For those of you who live locally, it's right, I think, on the southern boundary of Fawn Lake subdivision, if it's not actually in the subdivision itself. Clockwise, going to your left, that yellowish orange line, that's the survey boundary of Spotsylvania and Orange County, going to the Wilderness Run Bridge. Wilderness Run itself then is the rest of the remainder of the boundary between the counties to the Rapidan River. And along that boundary you see that red rectangle. That is William Jones's Ellwood. And just up above it you see another red star. That's the Vaucluse. Dr. Grimes is getting started just as William Jones is getting started. Also a little further to the left you see that long straight black line. In the 1820s that was the Orange Turnpike. Today's Route 20 runs right on top of the old Orange Turnpike in that area. It's the same road from the 1820s to today. Up at the top of the slide you see the Rapidan River, the blue line, flowing left to right, joining the Rappahannock River up on the right hand corner and flowing down through Fredericksburg. That then is the Wilderness Goldfields in 1826. Well, it didn't take long for word to get out. In fact, the Fredericksburg Herald, among others, announced to its readers that untold wealth lay directly under their readers' shoe soles. That easy living and royal wealth awaited their turning the soil and picking up the gold. Not so fast, but that's what they said. And then some other sure signs of what's called gold fever, or for experienced miners they call it Mexican measles. And that's the appearance of professional miners and mining companies, skilled mine workers, flim-flam men, con artists, and a huge bunch of investors, many of whom are totally clueless. And this is, and all of these people then descend on Virginia gold. It's the next hot spot in America. Now, to impress the investors, you got to show them something. Well, gold, basically, you're dealing with two types of recovery operations. One is dealing with placer gold. That is gold that weathering has freed from the lode material, and the gold flakes and the grains and maybe an occasional small nugget have drifted down into the streams or down into the hollows in the surrounding area and collected. Fairly easy to get, fairly easy to clean up, and then head to the bank. This is the kind of gold that was originally being mined by those people who were mining for William Jones and for Dr. Grimes. Now, that kind of fun didn't last too terribly long, and it was time to start getting the gold out of the lode deposits. And we're talking about minute flakes, tiny grains, pinhead might be a nugget. And you got these New York investors, and they say, we want to see the gold. And you hand up a lump of quartz because it's all embedded in horribly hard quartz. And you say, it's in there. And they can't see it. And so, what can you show them? Got to show them some effort. Well, fortunately, we didn't have one demonstration of effort in the wilderness area. It would not have worked. These Hornet balls are on exhibit at a gold mine in Georgia. And what you do is you take a half of a 55-gallon steel drum and you build this huge chicken wire ball using the drum as an opening, and then you plaster the chicken wire with concrete. And once the concrete has hardened, Then you shovel the ore inside, in through the opening, and then you and Vernon and Bubba and Sam and Rachel start rolling that thing around the field, getting the rock to crush itself. That isn't going to happen in Virginia anyway, as hard as the quartz is. Maybe in Georgia that worked. But I will guarantee you, you do some of that for a while on a July afternoon, and that pretty much takes care of the get-rich-quick mentality. You're going to spend more money on beer than you'll ever make on gold. Show you one that actually appeared in Orange County. That's almost equally ridiculous. This thing's called a trommel, but it's a huge rotating drum inside of which is a set of screens. There's a trommel screen. And at the blunt back end of this drum, you see a hopper where you dumped the material you wanted to separate, and then with the drum elevated in the rear, the material would slowly work its way down through the drum, the fine material coming out of one exit and the coarse rocky material coming out of the other exit. But if you thought that you were getting gold by doing that, not a chance. It's quartz whether it's big, it's quartz whether it's little. There's gold in it whether it's big, there's gold in it whether it's little, and you still got to get the gold out. The mining company that ran this was called the Lucky 100, and you'll see that it was here in the 1970s, long after the gold mining era of Orange County was over. The Lucky 100's luck ran out so quick most people didn't know they were in town. One of the other interesting things is that we think we found the trommel. It is, if it's a unit that we have spotted, it's located in the mine run area, and it's being used now by a landscape company to produce topsoil, which is a much more reasonable use for the equipment. But then we do have the piece de resistance that just boggles the mind. Here is an 040 Baldwin Tonka toy. I didn't know railroad locomotives were that small. I mean, you look at the size of the man in the cab and you realize how big the locomotive is you're looking at. I figure a 4-horse team could probably pull that thing backwards while it was trying to go forwards. Particularly since I'm sure by the time the Grasty got a hold of it, it was totally worn out and headed for the junkyard, and Grasty intercepted it on the way. But you get the steam up in that thing, and you go chugging past a whole group of those investors pulling an ore cart. I'll guarantee you those checkbooks flew open. Gotta get in on that action, man. Yeah. They must know something. Yeah, they know who they're trying to impress. But the savvy investors, they're looking for something literally more down to earth. And once the quartz has been jackhammered and blasted and brought to the surface, it's time to start making little ones out of the big ones. And you begin with a rock crusher. And in fact, I should show you something to give you an idea of what kind of stuff you're dealing with. This is a pick that was found at the site of the Vaucluse mine. And this was trying to be used to work on quartz. It's probably an inch shorter on each end than it was when it was made new, and the handle's been broken off, probably trying to prise a couple of rocks apart. That quartz would laugh at this. You know, what you've got to have are jackhammers and dynamite. That's how you get it out. So the first thing you normally would see is a rock crusher. This particular unit is a mobile unit driven with an old case steam engine. In fact, this particular unit shows up in Orange County usually every summer at the Somerset Steam and Gas Show pasture party. It actually, the owner of this equipment lives in New York State, but he comes to Orange County and demonstrates it just about every summer. All right, so you're taking your big rocks and you're getting them down to pebble size, getting them down to road gravel size. That's the beginning. Now you got to get them down to flakes. And a stamping mill was normally employed. These cast iron bars were raised with steel heads, hard steel heads, were raised and dropped, raised and dropped, raised and dropped into a tray of that gravel that had come from the rock crusher. And you were making flakes out of that gravel, tiny flakes. That's still not good enough. The next thing you're going to do is take those flakes and grind them. You're going to grind them into a mud. This is a Chilean mill, which was very, very popular. A Mexican mill was another type of grinding device. And I should point out that a lot of the early technology and terminology of gold mining came from Central and South America, where it had been going on for years. For a Chilean mill, you'd put the flakes in the big trough under those wheels, and then you begin to rotate the wheels. Rotate the wheels. Add a little water every now and then. You might rotate those wheels for a week before you'd wash that mud, flush that mud out of there, and put in a fresh set of flakes. Now, as time went on and technology came to the gold fields in greater quantity, something like a ball mill would take the place of both the stamps and the grinding machines. You would shovel the flakes into this drum, add a bunch of titanium steel balls, close it up, and start rotating it just like a dryer drum for a washing machine. And the interior configuration of that drum is such that it picks the balls up and drops them, raises and drops, raises and drops. And you can pound it into a dust, add water and make your mud. You want mud, you get a dust. You may have your gold, some of your gold floating away in the dust. That's how small it is. That's how fine it is. So you're going to create a mud. However you create your mud, you're going to wind up having to take it to a Headworks. This is a mine that became associated with the Vaucluse later on. Now, one of the earliest processes used to separate gold from that mud was to amalgamate the mud with mercury. You would put mercury into the mud and then grind it some more, and once you thought you had mashed it up sufficiently, you would flush the mud away and you would have yourself a puddle of mercury with the gold in it. And then at that point you boil. I said boil the mercury off to leave the gold. Now, if that repels you, there was another technique of extracting gold which used arsenic. Yeah, why not? You precipitated the gold. The gold was dissolved by arsenic, and then you precipitated the gold out of the arsenic. In other words, if you were going to do gold mining, you needed to leave your environmental sensitivities and public health concerns at the door. This was rough and ready mining. Now, one of the results of this, and I think the ban is still in effect, I haven't checked recently for a change, but there has been a ban on eating fish that are caught in the vicinity of the intersection of Wilderness Run and the Rapidan River. the story is those fish have got so much mercury in them, they've got to swim hard to stay off the bottom. Whatever gold you get, at that point, you're selling into a government market with a pegged price. But it was tough. The yield of gold was nowhere near Thomas Jefferson's 7 pennyweight. But there were plenty of people who wanted to try. Look at this map of that same gold mining area that I showed you for 1826. Here it is in 1849. The Vaucluse, you can see the Whitehall still, the big star. Lots of little mines around it. It looks like William Jones got mined out totally. But around the Vaucluse, there are a bunch of other mines, and some fairly good ones. The Melville, the Orange Grove were good mines. Another mine in Spotsylvania County, the United States mine, that was a good, highly productive mine. But look at the date on that map. 1849. What was going on in California as this map was being printed? Big gold. Big gold. Easy to separate and get out. Nothing like being in quartz. Big gold was being discovered in California, and other gold would be discovered at other places in the West. The real glory era of gold mining on the East Coast was coming to an end. And mine managers, skilled miners, and investors began to flee the wilderness. But some hung on. Some of the larger mines were still productive enough to be able to keep going. Some people were just plain flat stubborn and kept mining. But I would say that 75% of all of the mines that you see on that map were closed forever in 3 to 5 years after this map was made. Now, here is a graph showing Virginia's total gold production throughout the state. Palmer C. Sweet of the Virginia Division of Geology and Mineral Resources is the gold guru for Virginia. In 1980, he published his seminal article, Gold Mining in Virginia. He's updated it. I think the last update was 1988. And he has identified at least 301 mining sites throughout the state of Virginia, 90% of whom are in that crack, over the volcanic crack. Slightly over 10% of them are in the map that I just showed you a few minutes ago. Now, by the time you get to the beginning of this graph, which is what, 1897, you're down to a handful of mines that are operating, and they've developed some additional recovery techniques, flocculation, for example, flotation, and they are recovering not only gold, but they're also now able to recover the other metals, the silver, the zinc, the lead, the silver, to help cover the cost. They would soon find out it never really ever did cover the cost. But over there on the left-hand side, you'll see that at least there were several mines running till around 1900, and then the line drops down. And essentially at that point, you're dealing with the Vaucluse, maybe a little out of the Whitehall, maybe a little out of the Melville, but primarily the production for the state of Virginia was coming out of the Vaucluse mine in eastern Orange County. And then, lo and behold, look at that spike. What on earth went on? Well, The government was controlling the market for gold. And the government announced in 1934 that it was raising the price that it would pay for gold from $20 and I think 65 cents an ounce to $35 an ounce. And I mean, you would have thought it was the second coming. But it didn't take long. Some investment was found, and some mines did begin to open and run shortly, and find that $35 an ounce still did not pay, mainly because of the yield of the gold. And you get this, but you do get this tremendous spike. Well, what's wrong on the downside? The downside is a combination of two things. One, a lot of the mines other than the Vaucluse that opened went ahead and closed. They found out they still were not making money. The operators of the Vaucluse had their mine flooded. There was a tremendous flood in 1937 that flooded the Vaucluse, which by that time had shafts down 300 feet. And the mine owners took a look at that mess and said it's not worth pumping out. And they didn't. They worked some of the ore deposits that was still on the surface until November of 1937, and then they closed up everything. And according to Dr. Sweet, that's the end of commercial gold mining in Virginia. Other mines continued. In fact, according to Dr. Sweet, the last gold commercially produced in Virginia was by a mine in Spotsylvania County that was actually producing lead and zinc, probably for the World War II effort, and producing some gold as a byproduct. And that mine closed in 1947. And that was the end of gold mining in Virginia. But it was a real trip, no question about that. We got ourselves a lot of tales, we got a lot of stories, and we've got a lot of these things. And if you are interested in going out into the wilderness gold fields and to walk around and enjoy nature, I would suggest you keep your eyes down on the ground and keep your pets on a leash. There are these holes everywhere. And as I tell some local folks, you know, if your great uncle Poochie was living down there and he went out squirrel hunting one day and disappeared and nobody ever heard from him again, he was totally gone, Uncle Poochie may be a lot closer than you think. These orphan mine shafts just sitting there. Interestingly enough now, Dr. Sweet says that there's probably as much as 400,000 troy ounces of gold still left in the ground in Virginia. And most of it, of course, is in that big crack, and most of that is in the area that we've been talking about today. But before you grab a trowel and a bucket and head down there to get rich, there are a couple other things you need to know that the Division of Geology and Mineral Resources will tell you. And one of those is that if you're going to try to work what's left of some of the old placer deposits, you know, the loose gold, take a magnifying glass and a pair of tweezers, or you won't see the gold. The other thing you need to know is if you are going to work lode deposits in the quartz, there are none above the 300-foot level. Now go down there and go broke like everybody else. And thank you for your attention. Now, the Vaucluse begins its life as a property as a portion of a 28,000 acre land patent awarded to former Virginia Lieutenant Governor Alexander Spotswood in 1728. And Spotswood called it his iron mining tract. And he did mine some iron off of that for his blast furnace, which was further down the river in Spotsylvania County. But he mainly wanted to clear cut all of that land for the fuel to feed that blast furnace, to make it run. And it was people like Spotswood and the owners of the other furnaces that clear cut over this soil that turned out to be extraordinarily poor. The regrowth that came back was a tangled web of every type of vegetation that can grow in Virginia, none of it doing real well, competing for sunlight, competing for nutrients, competing for moisture, and taking up every square inch and fighting each other. And the end result was something called the wilderness. And the wilderness was a forbidding and indeed dangerous territory if you did not know where you were. Even as late as the 1860s, when some Civil War battles were fought in wilderness vegetation and terrain, and there were at least a few trails and a few openings, paths in the wilderness, it was still a very disorienting territory, and indeed could be one very treacherous to try to maneuver, try to get through, and it impeded anything the military tried to do. Now, it was in this wilderness then, later on, that gold was discovered. William Jones of his plant and his Ellwood plantation on Wilderness Run struck big gold, notorious gold, in 1826. Now, by that time, the Vaucluse was owned by Dr. Peyton Grimes. A man named Grimes had bought several thousand acres from the Spotswood heirs and named it Vaucluse. Apparently the property was more than well watered, springs, standing water, and what have you. And that particular Grimes knew about the huge, enormous Vaucluse spring in southern France, which coincidentally happened to be in the district of Orange, and he named this property Vaucluse. It had now descended to Dr. Peyton Grimes. Well, William Jones's Ellwood was just upstream on Wilderness Run, so Dr. Grimes did not need much time to realize that he too had gold. And like William Jones, we believe he immediately started leasing mining tracts to individual miners. But it wasn't long before he decided that he needed more and consistent and knowledgeable management of his mining operations. And he, in 1831, retained the services of the Virginia Mining Company of New York to run his mining operations. A few years went by, and Dr. Grimes decided that he knew how now to run a gold mining operation. He terminated his management agreement with the Virginia Mining Company of New York. He formed the Vaucluse Mining Company, Incorporated, of which he was the owner, and he began running the Vaucluse operations. And he continued to run them from 1834 until 1843. So Dr. Grimes invested over $70,000 in the Vaucluse operation, and we're talking about the 1840s. $70,000 was, I mean, he was a Vanderbilt. In 1843, Dr. Grimes sold the mining company and a 200-acre mining tract to William K. Smith of Fredericksburg. Well, it didn't take too long for Mr. Smith to discover that Dr. Grimes had not sold the Vaucluse because he was tired of making too much money. Production was dropping off, costs were going up, and Mr. Smith, having mortgaged all of that property, was now looking for a buyer for that property. At that time, we were still surface mining, and would continue to surface mine until the 1850s. But surface mining was surface in name only. We're talking about pits down in the ground, trenches down in the ground, 60 feet, and landslides and everything else. It was getting treacherous. In 1847, Smith was able to sell the Vaucluse to the Orange Grove Mining Company, which was mining gold on the nearby Flat Run. The Orange Grove's facilities now, just about all of them, under the lake that was created when Flat Run was dammed to create the Lake of the Woods subdivision. Now, the sale to Orange Grove was in 1847, and the Orange Grove promptly released this image of the Vaucluse mining town. Now, Dr. Grimes, in his tenure, was known to have spent roughly $70,000 on the Vaucluse, and apparently a chunk of it was in building this town, because Smith didn't have time to build it, nor did he have the money. A very interesting facility that existed down there in the wilderness, housing for 150 miners and their families, additional houses for mine managers and other owners and investors, a grist mill, ice house, public kitchen, a resident physician. This was an absolute operating town, and I'm sure the Orange Grove released this with the intent of getting investors to get in there and start giving them some money to do more stuff like this. Well, that was 1847, 48, thereabouts, when the Orange Grove started giving itself some publicity. And by 1852, the Orange Grove was starting to sink some shafts, finally. The shafts were going down themselves only about 60 feet. The lode deposits were still at that depth, and ventilation technology being what it was better that they not go any deeper than that. Then in 1852, the Orange Grove sells the Vaucluse to the Liberty Mining Company of England. And the Liberty Mining Company gets in, starts stirring around, and actually sinks 6 additional shafts over the next few years, and then itself is darn near sunk by the American Civil War. Production dropped off. In fact, in 1864, production was zero. On May 4, 1864, Corporal Horace Mann of Union Army stopped by the Melville, which is next door to the Vaucluse, and discussed mining with the owner-operator, who at that point was totally shut down. The entire Union Army was all around him. And in fact, the next day, the Battle of the Wilderness would start just a few 100 yards away from the Vaucluse. And by the end of that day, Sergeant Corporal Mann was a Confederate prisoner on his way to Andersonville, so I don't think he enjoyed his visit to Orange County very much. The Liberty Mining Company struggled its way through the Civil War. Then in 1867, the Liberty Mining Company gave up and sold the Vaucluse in 1867. The Liberty Mining Company sold the Vaucluse to the Rapidan Mining and Manufacturing Company of New York. And the Vaucluse at that point enjoyed its longest tenure. It ran under one ownership from 1867 to 1913. I think one of the secrets of success for this mining company was that it probably for some number of years did nothing and made the money to pay the property taxes elsewhere. Also, about that time, some of the newer recovery techniques were being developed, and they probably were, when they did mine, able to eke out a little bit more money from what they were doing than those who simply mined gold in the years before. But by 1913, the creditors were beginning to circle around, and the company went into bankruptcy. And before the trustees could conclude their files and close their operations, the new buyer was back in bankruptcy court. He had not been able to find the necessary investment. Then it was in and out of bankruptcy for a while until 1926, when the Vaucluse was sold to John A. Standish of New York. And Mr. Standish came, stirred around, created the usual furor. Everybody backed off and let him do it. But it didn't take him too terribly long to find out that money was not to be made mining the gold in the wilderness anymore. And by the time the mine manager finally ran off with the payroll, Mr. Standish decided it was time to declare bankruptcy again, the Vaucluse again. Now, I'll do a little sidebar conversation here. I used to do a lot of Civil War battlefields touring, and on one occasion, one morning, I was touring three gentlemen, and we were in Saunders Field, where the Battle of the Wilderness started in eastern Orange County. And I was going over the positions of the various units and the events that were happening. And one of the men said, "Aren't there some gold mines around here? Isn't there a Vaucluse mine?" I was kind of surprised that he knew how to pronounce it. Tell me about this Vaucluse mine." So I go through this same litany that I've gone through with you all, and I get to the point and I say, "The mine manager ran off with the payroll. That was my great uncle. He went to Chile and never came back." But Mr. Standish goes into bankruptcy court, and in 1929, the Vaucluse Gold Mine in eastern Orange County is bought by automobile tycoon Henry Ford. The stirring about is real. This man knows business. This man knows money. He isn't going to lose money. He knows something. And big times are going to happen here in Old Orange. Well, Mr. Ford knew more than to try to mine gold. What he really wanted to do was to loot the Vaucluse mine of its antique mining equipment for his museum in Michigan, which he did. The centerpiece was this 120 horsepower steam engine built in Cornwall, England, and sold to a mine in Northern Virginia in 1835. And when that mine went under, Dr. Peyton Grimes picked this engine up and brought it to the Vaucluse, where it ran all of the Vaucluse's machinery until electricity finally came to the gold fields shortly after well, in the 19-teens probably. And there's a photograph of that 120 horsepower steam engine as it is about to be taken to Mr. Ford's museum. Now, some years, many years later, Lynn Lewis, then the president of the Orange County Historical Society, is out west traveling, and for some reason she stops by the Western Museum of Mining and Industry in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And she goes out into the exhibit yard, and there it is. It somehow got from Michigan to Colorado. But there is the Vaucluse, and the information panel says it came from Orange County, Virginia. And the curator of that museum says, yes, indeed, that engine actually belongs in Orange County, but you can't have it. Now, as I say, Mr. Ford, too smart to mine gold. He ultimately, in 1934, sells the Vaucluse for the same price he paid for it, which was basically a song. So no, he didn't lose money. And it's bought this time by a group of folks from Fredericksburg. The Vaucluse has gotten cheap enough now to where some local folks thinks, you know, having been around it, they think they know a few things. They might be able to do something. And the principal operator is a man by the name of Moritz Norden, who is a mining engineer and a geologist and has experience in the western gold fields. And it looks like he might be able to do something with the Vaucluse. Hard to say, but it looks like he might. Sadly, less than a year later, Mr. Norden suddenly dies. And the company that had been formed by the Fredericksburg folks goes into bankruptcy again, one last time. And the remaining investors decide they're still going to give it a try. So they form another corporation, the VM Corporation, for Vaucluse Melville, because after Henry Ford bought the Vaucluse equipment, all it really was a mine with ore. So the Vaucluse and the Melville were initially bought together by this group. And they mined the ore at the Vaucluse and they processed it at the Melville Headworks. Now, these people made a run of it. They started in March of 1935, and they ran the Vaucluse every good day that they could run it until, well, it flooded during 1937, but they continued to work the ore that was on the surface until November of 1937. The longest steady run of the Vaucluse in quite some time. And the yield of the Vaucluse during this run was 0.156 ounces of gold per ton of ore worked. One of the mine workers went to college later on, wrote an essay, said more than $1 million came out of the ground, and that did not begin to pay the costs of production. And that's certainly true. You know, pure gold is what they call 24 karat gold. How they came about that, I don't know. Most of the gold that's mined is not free pure gold as it is down here. It's amalgamated with something else. And that works anyway because it looks like gold. Well, for example, people wearing gold jewelry, 40% copper, 17% silver, and some zinc. That's your jewelry gold, unless it's white gold, and then they back off on the copper and add nickel. But pure 24 karat gold, the way you determined it was you took the gold and those of you who've had geology, you know what a scratch plate is. Scratch it on the scratch plate, and then you've got these bottles of chemicals, acids, and you try this acid. No, it doesn't melt it. Try this acid. It doesn't melt it. Try this acid, and it melts. Okay, what was that? Okay, it's 12 karat. That's how they do it. There may be a better way now, but that's where the word acid test came from. We have an assay cup and a bottle that contained the fluid that is used to precipitate gold in a sample, and the assay cup is for a fraction of a ton. And between those two, you could determine the potential gold yield. And what you're looking at on this slide is a cut or a gallery at the 300-foot level. And this was done, I believe, in 1936, early 37. And each one of those notations on there is the value of the gold per ton at that particular point. Now, did you go down there and check on them? I don't think so. You waited for them to come up to the top and announce a big strike, and then you bought some stock. That's the way it was supposed to work. And in fact, the Vaucluse in 1936 sold $140,000 worth of stock. In the teeth of the Great Depression, they were able to raise that much money. The Vaucluse have flooded the next spring. They worked the ore samples, the ore outside, did not choose to pump out these shafts and galleries. It just wasn't worth doing. And then in November of 1937, the owners closed it up and walked away from it. And according to Dr. Sweet, the guru of gold in Virginia, that was the end of gold mining in Orange County. Gold mining in the wilderness area continued until 1947 with gold as a byproduct from a zinc and lead mine. But the era was over. Left us lots of stories, left us a lot of interesting memories. But I don't advise going down there and going broke. You can find cleaner ways to go broke. Thank you for your attention.